Hi, my name is Angela Ball, and this is my Biblical Basis project for Social Work 101 D04 at Liberty University. The books of the Bible that I were assigned are the first 7 books of the Old Testament, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Judges. I'm going to start by quoting Randy Alcorn from Eternal Perspective Ministries. He says, "Even if I am not to blame for the poor being poor, Scripture tells me that I am responsible to help them." Dr. Walter Kaiser from the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics adds to this quote when he discusses how God does not want poverty for us, but because of sin, it causes there to be poverty in the world, and we are instructed to follow God's commands to help those that are poor and in need. The first 7 books give instructions for helping the poor and needy as well as examples. Um, they are God's instructions to Moses that he is then to tell the Israelites. There were many that were vulnerable in this time, sojourners, widows, fatherless children, and slaves. An area where there was an opportunity to help those that were in poverty is slavery, which at first may sound like it wasn't an opportunity, but slavery in this time was focused around debt, not discrimination or race. It was considered generous to those that were in need. Exodus 21, verses 5 and 6 says, "But if the slave plainly says, 'I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free,' then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door or doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall be his slave forever." This verse just goes to show how generous these slaves thought their masters were, and how the household was pleasant, and it wasn't like what we see in American history with slavery. It was a time where poor people were given options to work off their debts, and in return they were fed and they were taken care of, and given a place to live. Exodus discusses this view of slaves by describing the laws that were in place to ensure the justice and prosperity for the slaves and their household. The focus at this time was on living together as a just society, not with different levels, but as the Israelite nation as a whole, so that they were all prosperous. One of the services that were implemented in this time was the Jubilee, which was 15 years from the Day of Atonement. The people would return all of the possessions of land and property that they had taken from debts, or indentured slaves were set free, and it provided a periodic restoration to all. So that way the society could function properly as a whole, as opposed to some people having more and others having less. The poor and the needy were also, and the slaves were given rights and justice as well. Exodus chapter 21 touches on this when it explains in verses 7 through 11 about the assurance that female slaves would be taken care of. And also in verses 26 and 27, it describes the protection for slaves, that they were not to be harmed or hurt. And this just further is an example of how the slaves were not property, but they were humans, and they were viewed that way. Some other commands for not mistreating or taking advantage of the poor, specifically in the judicial system, is in Exodus 23, verse 3 says, "Nor shall you be partial to the poor man in his lawsuit." And verse 6 says, "You shall not pervert the justice due to your poor in his lawsuit." These laws and commands were spoken to the Israelites to ensure that they did not take advantage or pervert the justice system for those that were in there for poor, or twist their words, and just make sure that the poor and the needy got the justice they deserved. And these commands are pretty relevant in the social work field, because as social workers, they are required to uphold this justice for the poor and needy in the court systems, and make sure that they don't get taken advantage of, and make sure that they are offered the proper services that they deserve. Um, Exodus chapter 22, verse 25 brings up scripture instruction on not charging interest for loans to other Israelites. The organization Your Faith, Your Finance discusses this command against usury and how it is viewed as a prevalent sin all throughout the Bible. When those that have loans out and owe debt to someone, as the lender, they are to help them by loaning this money, but not to profit from their vulnerability by gaining interest on it. The Bible instructs rather than to profit from the poor's loans, but we are to have compassion for them. In Exodus 22 verses 26 to 27, it speaks on that. Another resource that was available for the poor and needy at this time was the gleaning law, which in Deuteronomy 23 verses 24 through 25, it explains that the poor were able to, and the sojourners were able to go to the fields and the vineyards and eat their fill of grapes and pluck ears of grain. However, they were not allowed to store any or take any of it home. It was just as a resource for them to be filled on, so that they would not go hungry. Randy Alcorn, who was quoted earlier, points out that they were not handed the food. It was not a handout. God does not command us to hand out things to those that are poor and maybe lazy or idle, but it is giving an option for them to come and work. The Deuteronomy chapter 23 describes the option that they were able to go and pick it themselves and pluck the ears themselves. And it was a resource for them and a way for them to survive, and God commanded that option for them. Deuteronomy chapter 8 verse 18 reminds us that you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth. That's just a reminder that we do have power, and he will give us the options and the commands, and that he gives us that opportunity to go seek out and receive help. The things that God commands are described throughout the rest of chapter 15 for the needy and the poor. In Deuteronomy verses 7 and 8, he commands us to open our hands to our poor brothers and to do so willingly without a grudging heart. There's also an emphasis on showing dignity to the vulnerable and the poor people in verses 10 and 15. Some examples of this are not going inside someone's house when they owe you money, but trusting that they will return the money to you that they owe you. Not keeping a poor person's cloak at night because they want to use it as a blanket when it's cold. And also paying workers on the same day, because sometimes they rely on that money for survival. And Leviticus 19 verses 18 and 34 just basically covers why we do all this, and that is because of in Leviticus it describes the golden rule of loving and treating others as ourselves, even the sojourners and the poor. We are to treat everyone as equal. And the prime reason for doing this, and it's mentioned many times throughout the Old Testament, and specifically in these first 7 books, for the treatment of why we are compassionate towards the poor and the needy and the sojourners, is the comparison God mentions of the Israel slaves in Egypt. In Exodus 22 verses 21 and 23, it says, "You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat widows, fatherless children. If you do mistreat them and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry." And this can be compared to the Israelites in Egypt, and they cried out to God, and he allowed them to have their exodus from Egypt. Again, in Exodus 23 verse 9, it says, "You shall not oppress a sojourner. You know the heart of a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt." Leviticus emphasizes unity of the people, whether rich or poor. It emphasizes that all are called to be holy like God. Leviticus 19, verse 2 says, "Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." So just as God showed mercy and helped the Israelites who were crying out to him, he helped them. We are to be like God and be holy, and to help those that are crying out to us that are in need or poor, or vulnerable. Deuteronomy speaks on non-Israelites, which are referred to as aliens in the Old Testament, and the inclusion of their worship to the Lord. The book of Joshua touches base on this in the story of Rahab in Joshua 2. And it shows the example of being included and accepted into worship. And through the story where Joshua sends spies to the city, to Canaan, and Rahab is there and has heard of them and has heard of God and accepts them into her house and hides them. And in return, she asks that they spare her life and are faithful, and they do so. And that description, even though she was an alien to the Israelite nation, and that story just shows the importance of how the allegiance to the Lord over the land or the people is what's important. And that allegiance to the Lord is what should drive us to be there for the poor and the needy and to follow these commands that God gives us. And in doing so, we are promised blessings. The Lord emphasizes the giving and not taking, and the importance of following his commands in Deuteronomy 15, verses 4 and 6. And he emphasizes on the blessings received from giving by saying, "But there will be no poor among you, for the Lord will bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess. If only you will strictly obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all the commandment that I command you today." These Old Testament commands and examples all portray a society functioning as a whole. So we should use these examples in today's society and how we should view each other as equal, and have that focus on society of everybody prospering, providing where there's lacking, and accepting all into salvation and worship of Jesus with open arms. And we must remember that just as the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, we all have our times where we can be poor and needy just as they were, and we would want someone helping us, and we need to keep that in mind when we are helping the poor and needy. We are all in need of mercy and love, but some need it even more, and we are called to be like Christ, who is God. Scripture lays it out simply in Deuteronomy 10, verses 18 and 19, where it speaks on God and how he executes justice for the fatherless and the widow and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. Love the sojourner, therefore, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. And that is a great scripture to follow and to use as an example of what God does for us and what we should do for others, and how we should help the poor and the needy.